What happens when a ruthless cop meets the man he's harassed for years? This is a story about power, redemption, and the fight for change. Officer Hank Thompson had spent over a decade patrolling the streets of Edgewood, a town where racial profiling was a daily reality. Known for abusing his badge, Hank targeted the black community with unwarranted stops, threats, and harassment. But one day, he crossed paths with Jamal Big J Daniels, a man trying to escape his troubled past. Big J had spent years in and out of prison, but was determined to change. He lived quietly, staying out of trouble, yet no matter how much he tried, men like Hank wouldn't let him forget his past. On a hot, empty afternoon, their fateful encounter would change both their lives forever. Officer Hank Thompson was a man who saw his badge as a symbol of power rather than protection. For over a decade, he patrolled Edgewood with an iron grip, making life miserable for the black community. He pulled people over for no reason, made snide remarks, and carried himself with an air of superiority. To him, being a cop meant being untouchable, above the very laws he was supposed to enforce. His reputation spread fast, and people knew that if Hank was around, trouble would soon follow. Over the years, his unchecked authority left a trail of fear and resentment. Families watched their sons get harassed for simply walking down the street. Parents warned their children to avoid eye contact with him, knowing that even the slightest sign of defiance could lead to trouble. Hank's presence wasn't about keeping the community safe. It was about control. He saw every black man as a suspect, every gathering as a threat. And while the people of Edgewood had learned to endure his abuse, one encounter would soon make Hank realize that his power had limits. Jamal Big J Daniels had a past that everyone in Edgewood knew. Growing up in a rough neighborhood with few opportunities, he found himself caught in a cycle of crime from an early age. Petty thefts turned into street fights, and one robbery gone wrong landed him in prison for years. By the time he was released, he had spent more of his life behind bars than in the real world. But this time, things were different. He was tired of the system, tired of the life that had only led him to dead ends. Determined to turn things around, he kept his head down, living in a small rundown apartment on the far side of town, working odd jobs, and staying out of trouble. But no matter how much he tried to change, men like Officer Hank Thompson wouldn't let him forget his past. To cops like Hank, Big J wasn't a man trying to rebuild his life. He was just another criminal waiting to slip up again. Every time Hank saw him, he found a reason to pull him over, to question him, to remind him that he would never truly be free. Big J had learned to swallow his pride, to walk away, to not give them a reason. But even the strongest patience has its limits, and one hot summer afternoon, when Hank pushed him too far, Big J finally snapped. It was a scorching afternoon in Edgewood, the kind of heat that kept most people indoors. The streets were eerily quiet, a rare stillness settling over the neighborhood. Officer Hank Thompson cruised through town, bored and looking for someone to mess with. That's when he spotted Jamal Big J Daniels walking alone. Something inside Hank told him to start trouble. Maybe it was the silence, or maybe it was just habit. Without hesitation, he pulled over, stepping out of his car with a smirk. "Hey, you," Hank called out. Big J stopped, already knowing where this was going. He turned slowly, his broad shoulders tense, but his face calm. He had dealt with Hank before, just like so many others in the neighborhood. "Let me see some ID," Hank demanded, stepping closer. Big J sighed. "I ain't done nothing, man. Why you always on folks for no reason?" Hank grinned, but it wasn't friendly. He snatched the ID from Big J's hands, barely glancing at it before tossing it back. "Ex-con, huh? Guess some people never learn." Big J clenched his jaw, willing himself to stay calm. But Hank wasn't done. He stepped even closer, his chest nearly touching Big J's. Maybe I should take you in, just for old time's sake." Something snapped inside Big J. Years of harassment, years of swallowing his pride, years of being treated like less than a man. All of it boiled over in an instant. Before Hank could react, Big J grabbed him by the collar and slammed him to the pavement. The cop hit the ground hard, his radio skidding away. Dazed, he barely had time to move before Big J was on him, fists flying, years of rage pouring into every punch. Hank tried to fight back, but it was useless. The street was empty. No witnesses, no backup, no badge to protect him now. The only sound was the dull thud of knuckles against flesh, the sharp intake of breath between blows. It wasn't just a fight. It was an explosion of everything Big J had held in for years. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it was over. Hank lay bloodied and unconscious, his body limp on the pavement. Big J stood over him, breathing heavily, his fists aching. He looked down at the man who had tormented so many and felt no satisfaction, only the weight of what he had done. Without a word, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, vanishing long before anyone could find the officer left broken in the street. Hank Thompson woke to the steady beeping of hospital machines and the dull, throbbing pain that radiated through his entire body. His face was swollen, his ribs ached with every shallow breath, and the bright overhead lights made his head pound. Blinking through the haze of pain, he tried to move but immediately regretted it. It felt like he'd been hit by a freight train, because, in a way, he had. Then it all came rushing back. The street, Big J, the fight, the humiliation. A voice broke through his thoughts. "Good to see you're awake," said Officer Kelly, his partner, standing by the bedside with a cup of coffee in hand. Hank swallowed hard, his throat dry. "How long?" he croaked. 2 days, Kelly said, taking a seat. "Paramedics found you just in time. If they hadn't been driving by, you might not have made it." Hank let that sink in. 2 days out, cold. His body had taken a beating, but the worst pain wasn't physical. It was the realization of what had happened, of what led him here. "Jamal Daniels," Hank muttered. Kelly nodded. "Big J? He's gone. No one's seen him since. But don't worry, we've got every unit in the city looking for him. He won't get away with this." Hank closed his eyes. He should have felt angry, hungry for revenge. But all he felt was empty. Because deep down, he knew this wasn't just about Big J. This was about years of harassment, years of pulling over men like Jamal just because he could, years of wearing his badge like a crown instead of a shield. He had spent so long playing the tough cop, never stopping to think about what that meant for the people on the other side. A few days later, a knock came at the door. A tall, older black man entered, dressed in a dark suit, carrying a Bible in one hand. "Officer Thompson," the man said with a kind smile. Hank frowned. "Yeah, who are you?" "Reverend Jacobs," the man introduced himself. "Pastor of the church near where you were found. I've been praying for you." Hank scoffed, shifting uncomfortably in bed. "Praying for me? Why?" The Reverend chuckled. "Because everyone deserves a second chance." Hank stared at him, unsure what to say. No one had ever spoken to him like that. No anger, no judgment, just understanding. "I've heard about you, Officer Thompson," Jacobs continued. "I know the things you've done, but I also know that sometimes it takes a fall to see the truth. Maybe this is your chance to stand back up, not just as a cop, but as a better man." The words hung in the air long after the Reverend left. For the first time, Hank didn't push them away. He just sat there, staring at the ceiling, feeling something unfamiliar creeping in. Shame. And maybe, just maybe, the first spark of change. The days in the hospital were long and quiet, giving Hank plenty of time to think. Too much time. He replayed the moment Big J attacked him over and over, but instead of anger, something else gnawed at him. Guilt. He had spent years believing he was enforcing the law, keeping order. But now, as he lay there, helpless and broken, he wondered if he had ever truly protected anyone. Or had he just been wielding power because he could? One afternoon, after another sleepless night, Hank requested Jamal Daniels's file. His partner raised an eyebrow but didn't question it. As Hank flipped through the pages, he saw the usual: arrest records, mugshots, charges for theft, assault, and a failed robbery. But for the first time, he looked beyond the crimes. He saw a kid who had been abandoned by the system, shuffled in and out of juvenile detention, learning survival the hard way. He saw a teenager who had no one to guide him, a young man who had tried to break free but kept getting pulled back in. Hank had always seen Big J as a criminal, a problem to be dealt with. But now, he saw something else. A man trying to change, just like he was. And for the first time, Hank questioned everything he had believed about justice. Later that day, when his partner came by with an update on the manhunt for Big J, Hank did something no one expected. "Call it off," he said quietly. Kelly frowned. "What?" "I'm not pressing charges," Hank said, his voice firm. "He's not the only one at fault here." Kelly stared at him in disbelief. "Hank, the guy nearly killed you." Hank exhaled, staring at the file in his lap. Maybe I had it coming. For the first time in his career, Hank wasn't thinking about punishment. He was thinking about change. And for that to happen, the cycle of hate had to end somewhere. He decided it would start with him. A week after being discharged from the hospital, Hank found himself standing outside a small church on the edge of town. It wasn't a place he'd ever thought he'd be, but Reverend Jacobs's words had stuck with him. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. The Reverend greeted him warmly, as if he'd been expecting him. Sitting in one of the pews, Hank finally admitted the truth. He had spent years abusing his power, harassing people who had done nothing wrong, and he wanted to change. The Reverend listened patiently, then simply said, "Change isn't about words, Officer Thompson. It's about action." And so, Hank started showing up, not as a cop, but as a man trying to make amends. He visited community centers, spoke with local leaders, and walked the same streets where he had once instilled fear. But trust wasn't easily earned. The people of Edgewood remembered who he had been, and most weren't ready to believe he had changed. Some ignored him. Others met him with cold stares. But Hank didn't quit. Then one afternoon, it happened. As he was leaving a neighborhood meeting, he spotted a familiar figure across the street. Big J. Their eyes locked. For a moment, neither moved. Then, Hank took a deep breath and walked toward him. "Jamal," he said, his voice steady but honest. "I owe you an apology." Big J crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "I was wrong," Hank continued. "For years I treated you and people like you unfairly. I can't change the past, but I need you to know. I see it now, and I'm sorry." Silence hung between them. Big J studied him, his face impossible to read. Then after what felt like an eternity, he gave a slow nod. "We'll see," he said simply, before turning and walking away. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a start. And for Hank, that was enough. Hank Thompson's journey was one of reckoning, a transformation from a man who abused his power to someone who finally saw the damage he had caused. His story is a reminder that accountability isn't just about punishment. It's about taking responsibility and making a genuine effort to change. But can people ever truly change? Or are some scars too deep to heal? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more thought-provoking content.